Welcome back to another art vlog. Join me as I test out new materials from arthauls that got a bit out of hand, finish one painting and sketch the next, and go over my color palette and favorite pigments, all while keeping up with shipping art prints and art zines. Winter really makes me just want to huddle up at my desk and paint. Perfect to finally wrap up this beast of an acrylic painting here. My interpretation of Beren and Lúthien stealing a Silmaril from Morgoth. I don't know what it is about the colder months and reading dense fantasy books, but after the Silmarillion I'm now also rereading or re-listening to The Fellowship of the Ring while painting this. Do you have specific books or movies that you come back to during the cold season? Maybe the escapism of fantasy is what gets me through the dark and cold days. This painting was a challenge, and you could see it pop up in so many art vlogs, as I even filmed the very first sketches for this one months ago. I tried to push myself, painting a scene with everything I struggle with when drawing usually. Dramatic lighting, many hands, clothing folds, and a dark, imposing background. I got lost in all the details and kept losing sight of the overall vision a bit. But now that it's done, I'm still really proud that I actually managed to bring it all together. I think the clothing folds alone are a composite of a dozen or more reference images I shot. I was tossing a linen textile in front of a lamp and filmed that, then took screenshots to try and capture the perfect moment, and arranged all of those to flow together while, hopefully, still looking a bit surreal and magical. I'm not sure how many of you paint with acrylics on occasion. It can be a scary medium, with the fast-drying paints making blending much more difficult than, for example, with oil paints. But I love how acrylics force me to be decisive, to create sharp edges and to not muddy up my color mixes. Even if you've never touched acrylics and don't plan to, hopefully my thoughts on the color palette or compositions can still be helpful. After all, no matter the medium you paint in, certain elements are kind of universal. From the very beginning, when I'd sketched this illustration idea, I wanted the color palette to be dominated by the light sources. So this is pretty much all painted in that anthracynone blue, the transparent iron red oxide, and the Van Dyke brown as like a neutralizing dark color. That means, of course, that the palette overall is super limited. There's titanium white in there, of course, for mixing. A limited palette honestly doesn't always work in this extreme way for me. I decided to use one because it would make the painting so much easier, because it's so big and kind of complex for my abilities to pull off. And it also represents the two light sources that we have, the bluish light that I used the anthracynone blue as a representation of, which illuminates everything here, and kind of the magical cloak woven from Lúthien's hair as well is in that color scheme to kind of thematically and compositionally unite those. And then on the other hand you have transparent red iron oxide, which is the background illumination and everything kind of coming from this side. It's the evil light color in this piece. From that view it kind of makes sense to reduce the color palette, but it does ignore any kind of like local colors. So if she were wearing like a red dress, I would have had to use some other pigments in there to actually represent that, even if it is hit by orange or blue light, right? It would still interact differently from like a neutral colored earth-toned cloth. So I think in a way the simple color palette saved me, because that's how I managed to even like paint this I was a bit overwhelmed with everything. I rarely do complex pieces and still need to learn a lot about that. But on the other hand, it's also, a bit limiting, as the name implies, right? I could have maybe added more detailing, added more interesting costume choices, or created more visual depth by having a full color palette, but then focusing on a blue and an orange part of that. I think that's just something I'll have to practice more and have to learn more about. I did use some alizarin crimson towards the end to intensify some of the shadows, as well as just a bit of cadmium red light. What I really like about the golden paint tube packaging for their acrylic paint is that they show you the transparency level, and I particularly selected these because they are quite transparent. The transparent red iron oxide, of course, is kind of at the top of that, but even the very dark and Franklinone blue is quite transparent if you kind of compare it to something like an ultramarine blue. Same darkness level, but there's more of a see-through quality to this one. Same goes for the Van Dyke brown hue here, compared to something like a raw umber, which is completely opaque. So I kept that kind of in mind when I selected the paint. And then of course titanium white is pretty much completely opaque, so that's where the shadows being transparent, and the lighter we go, the more opaqueness coming in kind of happens. I do tend to use so much blue in my paintings, ultramarine, cobalt, or now the anthraquinone. I'm quite happy with how this turned out, and I think it's really helpful to then let it rest for a few days, and I'm really happy I finished this one. I had to visit the city around that time and picked up colors with a new painting in mind. I've been relying on blue tones so much, and I want to try and paint a scene with a different color palette for once. One sketch from around the same time as this stealing of the Silmaril scene would fit that challenge. Lúthien banishing Sauron after the wolfhound Huan defeated him. It's a more static scene and would leave room to focus on character design instead. A proper costume instead of my usual vague textiles. Here I'm warming up with a portrait sketch for Lúthien. I don't want to be tied to how I painted her previously. These are portfolio pieces to practice, not part of a series of work like, for example, my Dracula art scene illustrations. So each of these scenes can be a very different interpretation of the same characters, and I also don't want to rely on design choices made in the movie adaptations of Tolkien's work too much. The light here could be warmer, and I've now started to imagine a color palette more red and brown, with green as a complementary color instead of the blues I usually gravitate towards. While I like working on multiple paintings all at the same time, there's something special to finishing one personal piece and then reflecting on it and planning the next one with that in mind. And I feel like it gives me a clearer direction on how to move forward. Here I'm also trying out a vertical composition for the same idea. I've painted a lot of horizontal or square illustrations lately, both for my personal art and the occasional client piece, and I want to shake things up a bit. A vertical composition can also make Lúthien look more imposing, and it leaves more room for detailing of her character design, the costume and maybe hair accessories or jewelry, instead of the overall landscape and mood. I'm quite worried about painting the good boy, the wolfhound, Juan. I might have to construct a reference in 3D. Let me know if you'd like to see that process in depth in a future video. I want to make sure the lighting for this fictional dog looks realistic after all. Maybe our cat can serve as a fur model. We're now on the next day, and I did end up buying Viridian Green, so I'm looking forward to mixing with this one for maybe some more subtle tones than I can achieve with the phthalo green. I also bought a yellow ochre, which I already had one. I actually got a yellow ochre in the open acrylic line by Golden, and while I love the shade and texture of that one, I can only really use it for final color layers, as it is the slow drying version. So I really wanted kind of this basic color to also exist for underpaintings and the first color layers, and so I finally got one. Took me long enough. Here you can see the phthalo green. I should have specified that I have the yellow shade. I actually hop back and forth between the open and the regular heavy body ones, and I often buy more basic hues that I might use larger quantities of, or that are generally a bit cheaper. You can see this Viridian Green, for example, is a series 1, while the phthalo green is a series 4, so it's a more expensive pigment. If it's more of an effect color or something special and it's quite expensive, I actually go more often for the open acrylics, just because I am a slow painter. I paint quite small. I don't use up a lot of paint. So one concern that I have with acrylics is them drying out, and the open ones have less of a risk of drying out, so I actually tend to buy some of those special paints, and where I expect or want a tube to last multiple years, I'm more confident that these will not just dry up in the tube, because that's an issue I've only had once, and only with the heavy body version. One more paint I got yesterday. This is just a really cheap titanium white. I love the Shinhan acrylics. They are, of course, less pigmented, less intense than the golden heavy body or open acrylics, but I pretty much used just the Shinhan ones for over a year when I first got started with acrylic. Often with really cheap acrylic paints, you don't have any pigment numbers or light fastness information, and so the Shinhan ones, which is a Korean brand, and that's why they're so easily accessible, they actually do have all the pigments noted down, give light fastness ratings, transparency and opaqueness information. Titanium white is actually the fourth tube I've now purchased in my acrylic painting life, because the golden titanium white can be very, very dense and very overpowering. When I just need a little bit of a change, I often go for a Shinhan one. On the note of cheap alternatives, what with that Shinhan paint, this is actually a repurchase for me. These are white nylon paintbrushes, and they are incredibly soft while still having enough of a spring to them, so that they work for the heavier feel of acrylics. So these are actually not gouache appropriate, but they are perfect for acrylics. They're so cheap. I absolutely adore the Rosemary & Co brushes, especially the Eclipse line, but they're honestly just a bit too expensive. They are worth the price, but shipping from the US to South Korea or small brands like that can be very daunting price-wise. These are kind of my cheap alternative to that. Not quite there, of course, in quality. This is from the previous set. As you can see, I've been pretty much using these non-stop. They'll pop up in every painting process I'll be posting. And I also have their miniature golden synthetic detail brushes. which are softer than the nylon brushes, but I've been using these a lot for like very delicate acrylic. And as you can see, I haven't even used some of the larger ones, but some of the smaller ones have been staple brushes for that Luthien painting and Pandora painting as well. And these have also gotten me through most of my Dracula illustrations one way or another. So I got a backup set just in case. My main goal for the art shop yesterday was to pick up new packaging supplies, as now in late January, after the post-holiday slump is over, I've been shipping a lot of art scenes and prints again, but I also got a couple canvases just to try out. These are the ones made locally there at the small art shop on Jeju Island, and I haven't painted on canvas in quite a while. This is for practice. Then there was this new release by a Korean brand, Shield. I've used some of their acrylic paints as well as gesso. They came out with a new line of canvas, so I just thought the back looked really nicely made. Round ones can be really messy from cheaper brands. Textile looks really nice, honestly. Not yet sure what I want to paint on this. January also came with my biggest art haul in a long time. I count this art book here as part of that, and how fitting with all the Tolkien art I've been painting lately. John Howe is one of my big childhood influences even, as I saw his art first as a teenager, and honestly the love has just carried over all these years. It's not huge, it's not super bulky. It focuses on the sketches, which I always find really interesting. I love looking at sketchbook tours. There's something so personal about seeing sketchbooks. There are definitely also color paintings in here, of course. You've never seen like prints of his work up close. There's something so soft. He does use watercolors for a lot of his work. And yeah, I find that absolutely magical. John Howe's sketches look so confident, yet soft, if that makes sense. There's a confidence to his line work and to his design choices, but at the same time there's so much softness. I've mostly practiced portraits over the last year and only occasionally included simple backgrounds in my paintings, and that's something I really want to kind of step up. Who better to look at than John Howe's absolutely gorgeous nature scenes? Admire how dark his illustrations can be without losing detail, without losing readability. So I just maybe want to do some master studies of these in watercolor. I've also been listening to the Andy Serkis version of the audiobook of Fellowship while painting my Luthien paintings, so this feels just kind of on theme at the moment, and I've always wanted some more Lord of the Rings art books. The level of the structures here is something I really want to bring into my own art, where so often the architecture is very simplified, and I really should be more thoughtful when it comes to that. And again, the very limited value ranges he sometimes uses for his graphite sketches, breathtaking to look at. So especially with my plan of trying at least one painting that doesn't rely so heavily on blue tones, all of these deep greens that dominate these forest scenes are gorgeous to look at and be inspired by. So yeah, just really happy about this little art book. Makes me want to sketch a lot, so I hope you will see some more character design, background and landscape sketches in upcoming art vlogs. Really happy with this one. Maybe inspired by all these softer artworks I am so in awe of, I've been reaching for my watercolors more and more in recent months. After years of using the same watercolor palette, I felt the uncontrollable urge to add some new paints. And while waiting for spring, I also wanted to set up new travel palettes. as I've painted in my travel sketchbooks a lot last year and want to dive back into that as soon as it's warmer and less windy. I got this travel palette from the same brand as the acrylic brushes I've been using so much, and I'm surprised at how large it is. I can unfold it in a variety of ways, so I think this one will be great to use both outdoors for very quick sketches and sitting down in a cafe to paint a window view, for example. It's also very lightweight compared to my DIY or metal case palettes, so ideal for traveling, as my bag is just kind of getting heavier and heavier with all the art supplies and filming supplies I carry around. I'm very excited to fill this one. I also got a couple of these very tiny palettes just for fun and as gifts for artist friends of mine. Even the paint tubes are actually a shared purchase with a friend. We noticed that we both take forever to actually use up an entire watercolor paint tube, as we both paint small and not exclusively with watercolors, so it made sense to split the expense and share some of these so we can try out new shades without completely breaking the bank each time. I took some time one night to go over my existing watercolor palette. Some of the shades here are over 15 years old. That's when my grandmother gave me her set as a gift, and she'd even used it for a few years before that, so we might actually be pushing 18 years or so. That's all the large pans, all by Winsor & Newton. The half pans were later additions from when I was studying botanical illustration, and then years later, as I kind of got back into painting even just a little bit, I started to buy the occasional single tube of watercolor paint to expand my color palette. I wish I owned more tubes, as it gives me more freedom to kind of add the same color to multiple palettes, but you can see that this isn't a very cohesive selection. I'm lacking green tones, and there's some repetition when it comes to dark blues and reds, from alizarin crimson to different quinacridones, kind of multiple similar shades of indigo or Prussian blue. That's just because I kind of kept adjusting the palette, had some spontaneous buys in there that I should maybe have thought about a bit more. And I'm also missing any kind of lemon yellow or bright yellow tones in general. So yeah, while most of this palette is by Winsor & Newton, after moving to South Korea, different brands became more accessible, both local and internationally imported ones. Shinhan, Schminke and Holbein are very easy to find here. My personal favorites though are by Daniel Smith, which are also kind of okay-ish to find here in Korea. I love their quinacridone gold and all the granulating shades a lot and would love to expand my collection of these. So together with my friend, I purchased this set of Primatek colors by Daniel Smith. Now, these are marketed as gemstone shades, but they are blends of a variety of different pigments, not actually pure gemstone in any way, so just be aware of that before you make your purchase. I had swatched some of them on this color sheet a few years ago and still remembered them. And no matter their actual composition, I found the shades to look very pretty and also really liked the granulation they gave. So yeah, I have these little palettes here that I want to test out. So we just thought, yeah, might as well save some money, get some fun colors that maybe we wouldn't have bought just for ourselves, but that we are both kind of curious about. And yeah, which is why I'm keeping this palette here as of now untouched. I want to see the collection that she got to then kind of fill my palette with. She will take those home, but we both kind of get to use them. I'm pretty happy about it. Because I've had my Winsor & Newton palette for such a long time, I do want to kind of expand on that palette, but at the same time I have a lot of the basic shades. I have an ultramarine blue that's beautiful. I have a yellow ochre, it's all there. So now it's more of what kind of fun colors with a lot of granulation or like unique additions to my palette do I want? And there are some holes to my original palette, like for example the Hansa yellow was the first yellow that I added after like 10 years of using that palette, so I think maybe the original yellow had gotten lost. Also, my selection of greens is pretty limited, mostly turquoise, bluish shades, and then one single warm green, so I'm actually pretty excited to have this Shady-Eyed Genuine to dry out. So right now what I'm thinking for this miniature palette is I love this burnt sienna, it's just a perfect color for me. You can see I actually use this one quite a lot. I've talked about the Zorn palette before, so I want to try something kind of similar with maybe a quinacridone gold instead of yellow ochre to have a bit more of a punch. The problem with watercolors and the Zorn palette is that the titanium white is missing in traditional watercolors, so I'd either have to add gouache or bring in something else for cooler tint, so that might be one of those blue shades. I'm not yet sure what I want to do here, but I think starting with this as a base, having one black, and then seeing which 3 other colors, maybe from my friend's collection, which is like a fun little travel palette. And then as we go on and as I kind of find what I really like, I want to have this one ready for spring. I want to be a bit more experimental with my color choices in general, with my color mixing, and yeah, just have fun. Let's get to it. You can see that I'm actually pretty terrible at craftsy things like this. My hands have a slight tremble to them. Finicky little work like this often gets a bit messy, but honestly, who cares? This is for painting, not to look at, so. I'll be adding the new paints in order of how they are arranged on the packaging, because while I do add like a little swatch sheet to the palette, you'd be amazed at how easily I forget which paint is which. It took me forever to even look up like some of the names that I hadn't written down of these paints here. Yeah, I'll just go in order so that in the future I can even like Google the packaging and figure out which paint is which. I'm also specifically trying to fill the holes in my tube selection so that I have that added flexibility. I do have purple shades in half pan form, but would love one as a tube, so that's why we have this one here. As these sets come with very small tubes of paint, they were easy to use even for this tiny palette. And I also tried out my larger burnt sienna tube and managed to get that paint in there without too much of a mess. Here we go, one first thin layer, 1 burnt sienna and 6 new colors that I'm excited to start swatching at some point. Might need to add some stickers or something on the very generic tin case. So I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed in this exact shade here of the Rodin dyed. I expected something a tad warmer. It's definitely more of a magenta leaning color than what the swatch indicated. I like pinks, but I had expected more of a dark red and had wanted more of a dark red, so That's a bit of a disappointment, but the green right next to it, the jadeite, is exactly what I wanted. This is a warmer tone without leaning too much into olive or anything kind of yellowish. Just like a nice warm green. This one will be perfect for mixing, especially with all those magenta tones that I have as a balancing color, as a complementary color. The amethyst granulates a lot more than the jadeite. It's the kind of purple I really like. More of a desaturated violet. I love the granulation. I love the hue. This is exactly the kind of purple I love, the kind of purple I wanted. I love using purples as shadow colors. They go really well with yellow, ochre, raw sienna. I'm not sure which one is my favorite actually, between the green and the blue and one more shade that's coming soon. But the Mayan blue is also really beautiful. I was worried it would lean too much towards the Russian blue, which I already own, but it actually is quite different from that. It has beautiful granulation. Another one here, the hematite. Definitely less brown than the color swatch. I feel like these color swatches aren't the most accurate. To be fair, I went with quite light layers to properly show the granulation, but still, there's no warm brown. So in that regard, it's actually kind of similar to the Lunar Black, but it has a much stronger granulation. So what I'm really curious about is if I can mix this with some other shades that have no granulation at all and kind of break up two smooth layers. So yeah, I'm actually really happy with this one as a shadow shade. And generally my goal for this particular color set was finding a good, nice, warm green and finding some granulating options to bring more interest to my watercolor pieces. And then last but not least, this was a surprise. Somehow this Piemontite turned out to be the red I wanted. It's like a more intense burnt sienna shade, but it has these, I hope the camera picks it up properly, it has these cooler splotches in there. It seems to be like an uneven pigment. So I have the dark brown red and then something like a grayish pigment mixed in there, and it's really beautiful to see in real life. Where the Roldan dyed kind of turned out too much of a magenta, this is less brown and more red than I expected, and so exactly in my wheelhouse. This is the kind of paint I really like. So very interesting effect with that two-tone color. And then yeah, the hematite for a very strong granulation, the Mayan blue just because it's really beautiful, and the jadeite are probably my favorites, though as a lover of all things purple, the amethyst genuine will definitely also be a staple on my palette. The rhodonite genuine, if you were looking for a magenta tone or like an alizarin crimson kind of situation, you'd probably be good with this one as well. I'm really happy with this set, and my friend just tried them last night together with me, and she loves them as well. With all these packages arriving at my doorstep, I had to of course make sure that my packages left the doorstep. The Lunar New Year is coming up, and so I rushed to ship out all orders this week, heading to the post office multiple times to make sure everything got sent before the country shuts down for a few days. During the artzine pre-order shipping phase, I used my inkjet printer to print address labels, but now that I only ship maybe 3 or 6 orders per post office trip, that would be a waste of A4 label paper. I got sent this tiny thermal printer by Phomemo to try out, and it's been perfect for printing address labels as each new order comes in. Thermal printers don't use any ink, so that's another relief for me and my constant printer and ink refill woes. I thought that this being a thermal printer meant there's zero color to be had, and while that's the case for the black and white label, Phomemo also sent me their collection of color sticker papers. There's a deep blue, a pink and turquoise option, and these create cute transparent stickers. I loved experimenting with them. I can only order stickers from Korean printing companies in large bulk quantities, so I don't really get to play around a lot, and this lets me try out some different motifs to add to the large artzine bundle shipments. You might have noticed that this is a very tiny paper roll to go into a pretty large thermal printer. I can actually use different paper sizes in this one. The labels I'm using here all measure 5.3 centimeters in width, but the paper options go up to 8 centimeters, so I could use this one even for small reference prints, journal notes, and larger labels when shipping original art. I was worried this would be too finicky or a hassle to use, but I've been switching between different papers a lot without any issues. There are a lot of different options to choose from the opaque to transparent stickers to regular papers of all sizes. Thank you Phomemo for sending me both the printer and the label paper, as they've made my shipping process so much easier, especially when I have to prep just a small number of packages on that day. Now, with one last set of orders shipped the day before the Solal weekend, I'm excited to have some free time over the long holiday to test out my new watercolors and to start working on that new Silmarillion illustration. Happy Lunar New Year as we enter the year of the blue snake. Maybe that's a great theme for a future sketchbook page or illustration. I hope you enjoyed this very arthaul-y art vlog, as I maybe overindulged a bit during the new year. Let me know which materials you'd be most curious about to see in my sketchbook as I try out these color palettes. Thank you so much for watching. Happy Lunar New Year, happy Solal, and I hope to see you again in future art videos.